So I had a rather interesting conversation a couple of days ago with a friend who, for the purposes of this video, will go by as Nancy. She hates that name. I'll probably title the video by her name too. Well, her fake name, Nancy. But why was this conversation interesting? Many reasons. Part of the conversation was about dogs, cats, otters, river otters, sea otters, whatever otters. All the things that make life worth living at the end of the day. But another part of the conversation came to be interesting for a different kind of a reason. A traditional philosophic hypothetical, one first put forth by Derek Parfit, as far as I'm aware, essentially came to mirror part of her life. And the central question that the hypothetical asks, and some usual takeaways from it, seemed to help her with a personal issue. Help her no longer feel the same level of struggle within that she did before. So what was this personal struggle about? Nancy described how she felt resentful towards her mother for a rather long time, deeply resentful. Ever since she can remember, she has felt this resentment towards her mother. And the reason for this is the perception that her mom had committed a moral wrong against her. A moral wrong based on having conceived and birthed her, decided to conceive and birth her, all the while not having a great job or a good financial source, perhaps struggling with some specific mental issues, not being mature enough, you could say. Generally not being at a point in life where she could provide Nancy with what most people would consider a good start in life, so to say. And the question that nagged Nancy for the longest time was, why, Mom? Why could you not wait for 5 years, 10 years maybe even, when you were not as young and immature, to conceive me and give birth to me? I would have been way better off had you done so, had the parameters required for a good start in life been there to begin with. And when Nancy explained this resentment and the possible source of the resentment, which essentially seems to be this idea that her mom had done her wrong, that there was this moral wrong committed. I brought up this philosophic hypothetical to Nancy, which essentially mirrors her situation. That's all that it's about. But it asks a further question. It asks, does it make sense to feel morally wronged by your mother or your parents? Does it really? Let's say that your mom did not give birth to you then, but she gave birth to a kid 10 years later when her circumstances, in terms of the parameters being in place to provide you with an optimal start in life, so to say, were there. And she gives birth finally. And then she holds up that kid, that baby. I'm assuming she would hold her baby first, not the father. Who is that kid? Who is that kid she's holding on to? Is it Nancy? This kid certainly came from a a different egg unless unless her mom has had the same egg for 10 years, which could be possible, I guess, with technological advances, but that wasn't the case back then. Is this kid Nancy? I don't think so. I think this kid and eventual person, this baby and eventual person, is someone else altogether. Which is to say, if the alternative here is truly not you having existed, but non-existence, assuming that your life is still worth living, which I think we both agreed that it is. Her life is worth living. There's cats, there's dogs, there's otters. There's many kinds of otters. You would be very surprised to see how many kinds of otters there exist. Perhaps there was no personal moral wrong committed against Nancy at all. And when we discussed about this further, there's obviously some complications to this. At some point I could see how there's just this core idea that in reality there was no moral wrong committed. That seems to startle her, in the sense that she kept looking at me through this Zoom call like that. And then she said, damn, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here if this specific egg, didn't end up as me. I wouldn't be the one who's here. And then we talked more about the nature of this resentment, and it seemed that this new way of looking at things, essentially due to this philosophic hypothetical, or perhaps the extra questions asked by the philosophic hypothetical, asked by people in the context of this hypothetical, they help her view a deeply held assumption that she's had, that she was morally wronged, in a different light. And she seems to no longer hold that conclusion, which in turn has helped her feel no longer this devastating resentment. Now, I'm not sure if this resentment is totally gone. There may be complicated reasons it's there. There may be reasons that will not just, be malleable after just engaging in a short philosophic discussion. But this was still a beautiful event to me, at least in the sense that all these people think philosophy is completely impractical, so to say. But then I see someone who has had a life very much reminiscent of Parfit's hypothetical. And just a little bit of discussion seemed to truly help them in a way that perhaps a typical psychological consultation wouldn't. And this is not to say that, therapy is not important. It's just to say that this specific insight could add something different, a different element here. And then what's also interesting is that the story reminded me of when I was in primary school, and essentially I was having some of the same thoughts, just observing kids at school, coming from very different backgrounds. Some having a good image for the teachers, some not, some poor, some not. I remember thinking, what if these parents didn't give birth to all these kids? If you would have just waited for a few years, okay, we could have made society a lot better, and then you could give birth to them. And then I realized that had this been the case, all my friends wouldn't be there anymore. The people that would eventually exist to have to enjoy this better life than we did, they wouldn't be the same folk. I would have lost my friends, and that was unacceptable. Now, all that said, I would like to just note that I'm not implying that there is no moral wrong committed at all in this situation. But I doubt it's a personal kind of moral wrong towards Nancy. There may be a kind of impersonal moral wrong committed. And I would even argue that for something wrong to occur, morally wrong, it doesn't necessarily need to harm specific individuals. Which is a common assumption that an act can only be wrong if it does harm individuals. I think this is ultimately false, but I note this just so you don't get the impression that what I'm saying is there is no morally dubious behavior here whatsoever. But even if there was some moral wrong here, simply the fact that it was not personal towards her seemed to help her. And that was amazing to me, because this is just a philosophic hypothetical. Philosophy that means nothing, matters nothing, is just up in the clouds, suddenly became a little relevant. And I'm sure that Nancy will think about this more, and she may have perhaps some further questions or objections to the typical point derived by the hypothetical. But I think this was still an instant that illustrated some value to philosophy, at least some perhaps more practical dimensions of philosophy, which is what ultimately interests me the most, practical ethics and so forth. That was the conversation. I will probably make videos in the future going more in depth about this hypothetical and some responses to it. For those who want to look it up further, you can Google Derek Parfit non-identity problem. Thank you.